She had learned to be invisible long before she ever put on a uniform. Growing up as the only girl in a family of 4 older brothers in a dusty West Texas town, Sarah Jenkins understood that survival meant knowing when to blend into the background. Her brothers, all football players, all loud and proud and prone to solving disagreements with their fists, had taught her that the best way to win a fight was to make sure nobody saw you as a threat until it was too late. She carried that lesson with her through high school, through college, and eventually through the most brutal training the United States military had to offer. The Navy had not always welcomed people like her. When Sarah first raised her hand and swore her oath, women were still officially barred from ground combat roles. Though everyone who had been to war knew those lines on paper meant little when the bullets started flying. She was smart enough to keep her head down and her mouth shut, volunteering for every deployment, every shitty assignment nobody else wanted, building a reputation not as a woman who could do the job, but simply as someone who could do the job. Period. By the time the regulations changed and the special operations community officially opened its doors to women, Sarah was already through the pipeline, her trident pinned to her chest in a quiet ceremony that drew exactly 0 attention from anyone outside her small, tight-lipped world. Now she found herself at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, temporarily assigned to a joint training exercise designed to simulate urban warfare scenarios alongside Marine Corps units she had never worked with before. The base sprawled across thousands of acres of coastal plain, a small city of barracks, training facilities, and support buildings humming with the constant activity of America's expeditionary force in readiness. For the Marines who lived here, this was home, a place where tradition ran deep and everyone knew their place in the order of things. Sarah was an outsider, and she looked the part. She stood 5 feet 4 inches tall in her boots, with a lean build that could be described as athletic but never imposing. Her hair, cut short enough to fit under a helmet but long enough to be clearly feminine, framed a face that might have been pretty if it weren't usually set in an expression of watchful calm. Today she wore standard Navy working uniform, the blue digital camouflage that set her apart from the sea of green and brown marpat worn by everyone else on base. She carried a tray of food through the mess hall, scanning automatically for an empty seat, a habit born of years of entering rooms where she needed to know every exit, every potential threat, every pair of eyes that followed her movement. The mess hall at Camp Lejeune was a cavernous space, capable of feeding hundreds of Marines at once. Long rows of tables stretched from one end to the other, filled with young men in uniform, their conversations creating a constant roar of noise that bounced off the high ceiling. The smell of institutional cooking hung in the air, mixed with the distinctive scent of sweat and boot polish and gun oil that seemed to permeate every military facility on Earth. Sarah moved through the lines, selecting her food with the efficiency of someone who saw eating as fuel, not pleasure, and then turned to face the sea of tables. She spotted an opening near the center of the room, a small space at the end of a long table occupied by a group of Marines who looked up as she approached. Their conversation faltered for just a moment, replaced by the subtle calculation that happened whenever she entered a new group of male service members. She saw the looks, the quick assessments, the barely concealed smirks. She had seen them 1,000 times before. "Mind if I sit here?" she asked, her voice carrying just enough to be heard without shouting. The Marine closest to her, a corporal with the build of someone who spent more time in the gym than on the range, shrugged without making eye contact. "Suit yourself." She set her tray down and began to eat, tuning out the conversations around her, focusing on the food and the mental checklist of tasks waiting for her after lunch. The training exercise would begin at 1300 hours, a simulated assault on a fortified position held by role players pretending to be enemy combatants. Her role in the scenario was minimal, mostly observation and advisory, since the Navy had sent her here to evaluate rather than participate. She would watch the Marines work, take notes, and file a report that would probably be read by exactly 3 people before disappearing into some digital filing cabinet forever. The conversation at the table had resumed, louder now, more performative. She caught snippets of it, the kind of talk that happened when young men gathered and wanted to establish dominance without actually fighting. They discussed weapons, previous deployments, training exercises they had dominated. Someone was telling a story about a bar fight in Jacksonville, embellishing details for maximum effect. Sarah ate her chicken patty and green beans, allowing the noise to wash over her without engaging. Then the topic shifted. "So I heard they're sending some of those new joint teams through the urban course next week," one of them said, a lance corporal with a patch indicating he was part of some reconnaissance unit. "Mixed gender squads? Can you believe that shit?" His companions laughed, the easy laughter of people agreeing with a shared sentiment. "My cousin was in the army, did a rotation with some female infantry soldiers in Afghanistan," another Marine offered. "Said they were always falling out on ruck marches, couldn't keep up. Made the whole unit look bad." "Shouldn't happen here," the first Marine said, shaking his head. "Marines are Marines. We don't need to screw with what works just to make some politicians happy." Sarah continued eating, her face betraying nothing. She had heard variations of this conversation hundreds of times, in dozens of locations, from people who had no idea who they were talking to or what she had done. Part of her wanted to speak up, to challenge their assumptions, but a larger, more practical part understood that nothing she could say would change their minds. They would have to learn for themselves or not learn at all. The conversation grew bolder as they warmed to their subject. One of them, a sergeant with 3 chevrons and an attitude that suggested he thought quite highly of himself, leaned forward and lowered his voice slightly, though still loud enough for Sarah to hear clearly. "You know what the real problem is? It's not even about whether they can do the job. It's about unit cohesion. You put a woman in a combat unit and guys get distracted. They start competing for her attention, or they get protective, or they just don't know how to act normal. Breaks down the whole team dynamic." "Exactly," another agreed. "And then you've got the whole sexual assault thing. I'm not saying it's right, but you put men and women together in close quarters for months. Something's gonna happen. It's just biology." Sarah felt her jaw tighten slightly and forced herself to relax. She had heard this one before, too, the implication that men couldn't control themselves, that women were inherently a disruption, that the solution to sexual assault in the military was to keep women out, rather than hold men accountable. It was lazy thinking dressed up as practicality, and it made her want to scream. But she remained silent, because screaming would accomplish nothing, and because she had learned that the best response to ignorance was often to let it expose itself. More Marines had joined the table now, drawn by the conversation or simply by the need for seating space. The group had grown to perhaps a dozen, mostly younger, enlisted men, though a few non-commissioned officers had drifted over as well. They continued their discussion, unaware or unconcerned that the woman at the end of the table might be listening. "I heard the Navy's actually got women going through SEAL training now," someone said, and Sarah's attention sharpened despite herself. "Can you imagine? A female SEAL? That's got to be a joke, right?" "Probably just for publicity," the sergeant said confidently. "They'll let her go through the motions, maybe even graduate her if she's got connections, but you know she's not going to a real team. No way she'd survive a deployment." "Wouldn't want to be on that team if she did," another Marine added. "Having to carry her sorry ass through every mission. We'd have to change the name from SEALs to SEALs with training wheels." Laughter erupted around the table, loud and dismissive. Sarah kept her eyes on her tray, methodically cutting her chicken patty into pieces, chewing each bite with deliberate calm. She had been through BUD/S, through Hell Week, through the relentless physical and mental torture designed to break everyone who attempted it. She had rucked more miles than these Marines had probably run, had swum in water so cold it felt like knives, had been starved and sleep-deprived and pushed to every limit of human endurance. She had done it not for publicity, not to prove a point, but because she wanted it more than anything she had ever wanted in her life. And she had made it. The conversation continued, growing more graphic in its dismissiveness. They speculated about physical capabilities, about what would happen if a female operator was captured, about the supposed impossibility of a woman carrying a wounded teammate to safety. And they spoke with absolute certainty, the confidence of people who had never been forced to confront their assumptions, who had built their identities around a particular vision of what a warrior should look like. Sarah finished her meal and stood, gathering her tray. As she turned to leave, one of the Marines, a young private first class who had been quiet until now, caught her eye and offered a small, almost apologetic shrug. She gave him nothing in return, just a brief meeting of gazes before she walked away, depositing her tray in the rack by the door and stepping out into the humid Carolina afternoon. The air outside hit her like a wall, thick with moisture and the distant sound of small arms fire from some training range. She stood for a moment, letting the heat wash over her, feeling the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. The conversation in the mess hall had not surprised her, had not even particularly angered her. It had simply confirmed what she already knew about the world she had chosen to inhabit. She would never be fully accepted by people like that. Never be seen as anything other than an anomaly, a curiosity, a problem to be solved. And that was fine. She did not need their acceptance. She had earned something far more valuable than their approval. She had earned her place among the best warriors on Earth, and no amount of ignorant chatter in a mess hall could ever take that away. She walked toward the training area, her boots crunching on the gravel path, already shifting her mental focus to the afternoon ahead. The exercise would be challenging, she knew, not because the Marines were incompetent, but because urban warfare was always chaotic, always unpredictable. She would watch, she would learn, and she would do her job. And if any of those Marines from the mess hall happened to recognize her later, happened to put together the pieces and realize who they had been talking about, that was their problem to deal with. She had already moved on. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Sarah made her way through the mock city, a sprawling complex of concrete buildings designed to replicate the kind of environment American forces had been fighting in for decades. The structures showed the scars of countless training exercises, bullet holes pockmarking walls, windows shattered and replaced and shattered again. Graffiti in languages nobody actually spoke spray-painted on every available surface. It was a stage, but a deadly serious one, and where mistakes could cost lives even in training. She found her position in a building overlooking the main assault route, a second-story room with windows offering a clear view of the approach. A few other observers were already there, officers and senior enlisted from various units, sipping coffee from thermoses and making small talk about the upcoming exercise. Sarah nodded to them and found a spot near the window, pulling out a small notebook and a pen. The exercise began precisely at 1300 hours, the crack of blank fire echoing through the mock city as the assault force moved into position. Sarah watched through binoculars as the Marines advanced, using cover and concealment, communicating with hand signals and short bursts of radio traffic. They moved well, she noted, their training evident in every coordinated step. And these were professional soldiers, regardless of what they thought about women in combat. For the next several hours, she observed and recorded, noting strengths and weaknesses, tactics that worked and tactics that needed refinement. The exercise grew increasingly complex as it progressed, incorporating civilian role players, simulated casualties, and the kind of chaos that characterized real urban combat. Sarah found herself impressed more than once by individual Marines who showed initiative and adaptability, qualities that could not be taught but could be cultivated. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, the exercise wound down. The last building was cleared, the last role player subdued, the last simulated casualty evacuated. Sarah closed her notebook and stretched, feeling the stiffness in her muscles from hours of standing and watching. The other observers were already filing out, heading for debriefings or dinner or the simple luxury of a shower. She followed, but slowly, taking her time, enjoying the relative quiet after the noise of the exercise. Back at the mess hall, the dinner rush was in full swing. Sarah collected her tray and once again scanned for a seat, this time finding a spot near the back wall, away from the main flow of traffic. She ate quickly, eager to get back to her temporary quarters and type up her notes before the details faded. The conversations around her were different now, focused on the day's events, on who had performed well and who had screwed up. She heard her own name mentioned once, a question about who the Navy observer was, followed by a shrug and a change of subject. She was nearly finished when a shadow fell across her table. She looked up to find the sergeant from lunch, the one with 3 chevrons and strong opinions, standing over her with an expression she could not quite read. "You're the Navy observer, right?" he asked. His tone was different now, less confident, almost uncertain. Sarah nodded, setting down her fork. "That's right." He shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable. "I saw you watching during the assault on Building 4. You were taking a lot of notes." "I was." "Can I ask what you wrote? About my squad, I mean." Sarah considered him for a moment. He was young, probably no more than 25, with the kind of face that would look boyish for another decade. Up close, she could see the tension in his jaw, and the slight furrow between his eyebrows that suggested he was not accustomed to asking questions, only answering them. "Your squad performed well," she said. "Good use of bounding overwatch. Your fire team leaders communicated effectively. The only thing I noted was that you could improve your transition from movement to assault. There was a hesitation when you reached the breach point that cost you about 3 seconds. He absorbed this, nodding slowly. 3 seconds. That's nothing in training. It's everything in combat. Something flickered in his eyes, a recognition that she was not just some random sailor taking notes to fill a requirement. You've been in combat? He said. It was not a question. Sarah did not answer. She simply looked at him, letting the silence stretch. The sergeant seemed to struggle with something, words forming and then dying on his lips. Finally, he spoke, his voice lower now, meant only for her. I said some things at lunch about women in the teams. I didn't know you were... I wasn't anything, Sarah interrupted gently. I was just a person eating lunch. He nodded, looking away. Right. Well, thanks for the feedback about the transition. You're welcome. He turned to leave, then stopped, looking back at her. Can I ask you something? Off the record? Sarah waited. Do you ever get tired of it? The assumptions, the attitudes, always having to prove yourself? She thought about the question, really thought about it, for the first time in years. Did she get tired? Of course she did. There were days when the constant weight of being different, of being watched, of being judged by standards that applied to no one else, it felt like it might crush her. There were moments when she wanted to scream at every smug, ignorant face she encountered to demand that they see her for who she really was instead of who they assumed her to be. But tired was not the same as defeated. Tired was not the same as broken. "Every day," she said quietly, "but I got tired of being told what I couldn't do a long time ago. That was worse." The sergeant held her gaze for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. Some small crack in the armor of certainty he had worn at lunch. Then he nodded once and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of Marines. Sarah sat alone for a while after he left, staring at nothing, thinking about the path that had brought her here. She thought about her brothers, and about the fights she had avoided and the ones she had been forced to win. She thought about BUD/S, about the freezing water and the burning sand and the voices in her head that told her to quit, to give up, to accept that she was not good enough. She thought about the day she had received her trident, the weight of it in her hand, the knowledge that she had done something almost nobody in human history had ever done. And she thought about the Marines in the mess hall, the ones who had laughed and joked and dismissed the very idea of a woman like her. They were not bad people. She understood that. They were products of their environment, shaped by traditions and assumptions that had gone unchallenged for generations. Some of them would learn, as the sergeant seemed to be learning, that the world was more complicated than they had been taught. Others would cling to their certainties until the day they died, never understanding that they had limited themselves far more than any policy or regulation ever could. Sarah finished her meal and stood, gathering her tray. As she walked toward the door, she passed a table where a group of young Marines were laughing about something, their voices bright and careless in the way that only the very young could manage. One of them looked up as she passed, and for just a moment, their eyes met. She saw nothing in his gaze but the casual disinterest of a stranger, and she was glad for it. Let him remain ignorant, she thought. Let him live in his small world of assumptions and certainties. She had a bigger world to inhabit, and she had earned every inch of it. And the night air was cool now, a breeze blowing in from the ocean carrying the salt smell of the coast. Sarah walked toward her quarters, her footsteps steady on the pavement, her mind already turning toward tomorrow's tasks. There would be more exercises, more observations, more reports to file. And eventually, there would be another deployment, another mission, another chance to do the work that had become the entire focus of her existence. She thought about the sergeant's question, about whether she got tired of always having to prove herself. The answer was yes, but it was also no, because the proving was not for them. It had never been for them. It was for herself, for the girl in West Texas who had watched her brothers and learned that the world would always try to tell you who you were supposed to be. And the only question that mattered was whether you believed them. Sarah Jenkins did not believe them. She never had. And as she disappeared into the darkness of the Carolina night, heading toward another day of proving nothing to anyone except herself, she carried that knowledge like a shield, like a weapon, like the most valuable thing she owned.